Yeah, well, I did see as people were coming in, I saw names flash by, and I'm very thankful for so many people who've come, come to sort of hear some of what I have to say, and also uh, begin a type of movement, uh, you know, uh, a sort of beyond the the engagement, the essential engagement with Isaac Newton. Of course, that was primarily uh, where uh, where Donald Ault, of course, made his mark, and so it's just pretty exciting to have everybody here. It's pretty exciting to be talking Blake, in as many time zones as there are people that are awake and interested. Um, and so I'll go ahead and actually begin my presentation now. And so I'll just go slide by slide, and then so Jason, should I tell you when it's next slide, or Anis?
Yes,
Probably.
if you could just
Okay.
say next slide, and then Anis will click on. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Well, here we go. So slide one obviously is Ancient of Days. So before I do anything else, I just want to thank everybody for joining this conversation regarding William Blake's complicated relationship to science, uh, which also provides an occasion to revisit in the process two scholars, Jacob Bronowski and Donald Ault. Bronowski has been gone for a while, but not forgotten. But Donald Ault actually died right as as COVID sort of began to explode, and so these two scholars spent considerable energy illuminating the crucial relationship of Blake and Newton. So I offer Blake's famous image of Ancient of Days, which serves as the frontispiece, as most of you know, for Europe, a Prophecy, as the titular image for my presentation. Since its visual elements serve, excuse me, just a sec, let me knock back some tea, thank you. As a unifying thread across our conversation, that is, this particular image we can come back to again and again. I will return to the image in slightly altered form, i.e. a book cover and an illustration within a book, to conclude my formal comments, but simply say that it's visual composition, which establishes its hoary hair, Urizen leaning out of another figural eye, and that opens my talk and concludes my talk on the illuminated prophecy. In most conversations with my students and colleagues, the first principle shaping such relations is framed within two assertions. Quote, excuse me, science is the tree of death, which appears in the famous Laocoon engraving, and the dark religions are departed and sweet science reigns, which serves as the closing pronouncement for Vala, or the four Zoas, and actually ends up being virtually the last statement in a book called Origin, and we can come to that. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So here are the two contexts that I just raised, right? So on your left is the Laocoon engraving. On the right is the first, sort of edition of Vala of the Four Zoas. And in the former, the language itself forms a verbal second skin for the entrapped figures who writhe in an overt form of mind-forged manacles, and who thereby figure forth an embodiment of what Frederick Jameson long ago termed collective entrapment in a prison house of language. And yet the engraving equally offers a cure to this malady. Through the cultivation of imagination, which shapes, quote, the eternal body of man. More importantly, the design forces its readers to undertake serious labor to peel back the enclosing linguistic layer, thereby generating through the process of reception an active rather than passive method to liberate knowledge from its figural and linguistic contortions. Indeed, it is precisely the agency of the imagination that dispels the, quote, dark religions of Newtonianism, which functions as a controlling ideology attachment, an ideological attachment to a certain form of materialism associated with the experimental sciences. As Robert Markley makes clear, and this is a quote from Markley, Newtonianism must be seen not simply as a form of empirical science or specialized research, but as an ideological structure of belief that integrated scientific research into the political and economic operations across British society. So I think maybe the next slide will be great. Thank you. And so this is just my transition slide. So part of what we're now going to move into is a look at Blake's visual engagement with, for lack of a better word, the Newtonian worldview. And that means, I think, inevitably, we have to turn to the famous paintings that occur in the center of Blake's most productive, even prolific decade, the 1790s. Okay, why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide? Thank you, Anise. And so we have the figures of Newton. On the left, obviously, the 1795 painting, Newton. And on the right, the equally famous, I would argue, Palozzi's Newton after Blake. And so I want to speak to some of this. So one need only contemplate Blake's famous painting of a muscular Newton immersed beneath what Blake termed the sea of time and space to feel the power ceded to the Newtonian structuration. Newton rests on a rock and traces with his compass the mathematical operations of the cosmos. His downward gaze and constricted vision offer a visual critique of the ideological elements associated with the Lucasian professor of mathematics and his clockwork mechanics, which is given verbal form 7 years later in Blake's famous November 22nd, 1802 letter to Thomas Butts. And of course, I have a feeling everybody knows this, but, really in a way, one can't confront this material without it. Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. While the general assumption often suggests that the rise of contemporary physics in the 19th and 20th centuries, roughly from Sir Humphrey Davy to Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, broke through the ideological dominance of Newtonianism. And yet, the monumental sculpture of Sir Edward Palozzi, Newton after Blake, which greets visitors, of course, to the British Museum, suggests that vestiges of this ideological presence persists. Next slide. this section is on the pains of creation. And notice that the paintings now are all basically 1795. And so, an equally famous painting, also in 1795, Elohim creating Adam, offers a visual critique which melds the scientific and the theological. As Elohim literally drags Adam from the clay, the drama of creation unfolds against the background of a Newtonian void, while the figures of Adam and Elohim establish the foreground. But when you look at the background, that background is defined by math, by rays of light, by arcs against which figuration occurs. That is to say, there is a critique of Elohim literally dragging Adam from the clay, yet the backdrop is Newtonian. And so we have a sort of combined image here of both the scientific and the theological, and the degree to which one can figure as either background or foreground, depending on your point of view. Okay, next slide, I think. So we actually saw the sort of pains of creation and the backdrop against which that creation occurs. And another 1795 painting, God Judging Adam, shows the punishments of materialism. And the reason I argue it's the punishments of materialism is we begin to get a crucial symbolism that actually runs through the very end of Blake's presence on this world, since he was working on his deathbed on like Dante designs and whatnot. Here we see Elohim slouched on his fiery car. Again, look at the vectored rays and the circle that define the chariot of God, to use Blake's term from the title. And God is punishing Adam, and the way that he punishes Adam is literally through his fingers. And again, this is a sort of echo, I think, of from the frontispiece, from the frontispiece to Europe, a Prophecy, in which the fingers form a type of compass that intersects and looks like it actually enters Adam's brain. Now, the other thing but there's all sorts of other equally present images of this. For example, the reins that hold back this horse of instruction also takes, as it emerges from beneath the head and across the back, a compass. Adam's legs form another compass. And so part of what we get here is that part of the punishment of materialism is the sort of impossible mathematics of what we need to negotiate. And most problematic of all, I would argue, is that slowly but surely, and again, this is what we will see over and over again as we move to the end of the canon, what we see is a sort of like mirrored dynamic in which God and Adam figure each other. And so in a way, they function as a sort of mirrored relationship. And I can get a little more complicated later on in the conversation if you want, because the other science that's not going to be talked about here, but will be part of the final piece of this presentation, which is going into a a volume on a sort of revisiting of Blake. And so this mirror dynamic, clearly makes the point that that God is said to create in His image. But of course, the Blakean position is that we project upon the vegetable glass of nature, and in our creation of our deities, we project our own selves, right? Something that's covered really quite in detail in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Anise, yeah, let's take the next slide. Oh, I think we can go ahead and pass that one by. Yeah, I just wanted to let you know what was coming. So here are the two figures that stand at the portal, as it were, of this long essay that will be going into a collection of essays coming out of Rutledge on William Blake. Jacob Bronowski. Most of you know Jacob Bronowski from probably. I've got my audio visuals here, right? So most of us probably know Bronowski, if we're Blake scholars, through William Blake and the Age of Revolution. And it is a full, I mean, it's a sort of, it exerted a massive influence, not necessarily, I would argue, in literary critical contexts, but part of what it did, given Bronowski's other work, Science and Human Values, The Identity of Man, The Common Sense of Science, The Origins of Knowledge and Imagination, which, of course, no surprise, actually has Blake's small print, small sort of print image of I want from the Gates of Paradise. The Visionary Eye, which is his essays on art, literature, and science. And last but not least, where those people that are not scholars, that are not aficionados of Romanticism or know anything about it, confronted Blake and Newton together in Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. Now, one of the interesting things about Bronowski is he was certainly, in every single book that I just held up, there's probably at least a minimum of 5 to 7 evocations of Blake, and some of them, and I'm not counting William Blake in the Age of Age of Revolution. I'm not counting that one because obviously Blake's on every page. But all those other works, Blake is, Bronowski profoundly embraces Blake and occasionally points to how Blake is wrong, but in his error, sort of presages, things to come. The other thing about Jacob Bronowski that's interesting, and this will tie into the tail end of my paper today. So the other thing that he's done is he's lecturing all over. He's lecturing all over the country. Actually, he's lecturing all over the world. And part of the majority of people that he's lecturing to are, in fact, scientists. And it was his constant, and I do mean constant, evocation of Blake as a figure and as a pattern of thought that leads to and helps us comprehend what emerges through relativity on the one hand and quantum dynamics on the other. And so Bronowski did this unbelievable sort of service, if you will, to Blake studies by presenting Blake to an audience that potentially had never encountered Blake. I mean, I don't know about at your other universities, but people can sort of come through our university still without ever having any opportunity to confront Blake, except for in forms of popular culture. And Jason actually has spent a great deal of energy writing about that as well, I think, in a couple of the volumes that we share. Jacob Bernowski is part of my return to visionary physics, because that return with his sort of presentation of this to a surprisingly different audience actually helped fuel Blake's emergence as a crucial figure inside of what we would call the new physics of relativity and quantum. Donald Ault. I had the good fortune of being on a panel only once. I only met Donald once, but it was like the best possible occasion, because we shared a panel in the very first at the very first Lacan Language and Literature Conference at Kent State University in 1989. I finished my I had finished my exams, my doctoral exams, which were like unfolded over 5 days, 5 exams, and we jumped in the car and drove to Kent State. And Donald and I had the morning panel, and so I was presenting material that's already been published on the good fit between sort of Blake's approach and Lacanian dynamics. That one was in relation to Blake's illustrations for Gray's Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat. And Donald and I got to know each other well at that conference, and then we corresponded later. And when I heard that of his death, I just felt like that the time came to return to what he did, not in the book itself, that is Visionary Physics, because there the primary thrust is directly at Newton. What's floating in the footnotes is Donald's sense of where this leads, and of course it led to a great deal of material that connects Blake to, again, the new physics that emerged during the 20 years that shook physics at the beginning of the 20th century, and that is the coming of relativity and then quantum. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and go. I don't want to make a long story endless, so let's go to the next slide, Denise. And now this is why I find that it's necessary for us to return to visionary physics and come to grips with Blake's constant evocation in complicated texts of physics. The book on the left, Ian Stewart and Martin Golubitsky, Fearful Symmetry is God a Geometer. The introduction is sort of interesting, simply because, and you'll notice that Ancient of Days is the cover art for that book. And what they say so they use Blake's, image as cover art, and then say 2 pages in, is God a geometer? And they say, oh, yes, there's no doubt about it. And they use Blake's image as a way of, you know, as a way of promulgating that view. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I read that and went, no, God is not a geometer. It's much more slippery and complicated than that. And so it's part of what I came to confront when I was looking at a wide range of texts in the sciences that evoke Blake for any number of things. Certainly cover art imagery, but he tends to be misread. That is, some scientists tend to misread Blake and use an image like, say, Ancient of Days as confirmation for their own view of God as a geometer. The other book on the right is somebody that I actually engaged with quite closely when I was writing romantic dynamics, and I had asked. He was a practicing physicist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Tony, it's Anthony Z. I read his book, and so I just, out of the blue, I just sort of dug out his email and wrote him, and we ended up entering into a type of a very dynamic exchange, and how he felt how Blake functioned in this sort of weird and different environment. Yeah, I think, Anis, we can go next to the next slide. And so Tony was the one that said to me, he goes, I think that Blake is a strange attractor to people working in physics. And it's because, and I don't want to give away the end of my paper, he said, it's because, the way that he approaches some of the material world, the way that he approaches the material world is really quite in accord with the new cosmos that was emerging. And let me see, Anthony and I were engaged in this dialogue in the mid 1990s, I think. And so when he says strange attractor, I wanted to go ahead and give you a sort of operative definition of a strange attractor. It is certainly in physics, but it's in chaos theory as well. Conception associated with chaos theory, when a magnetic basin or point of instability serves as both a source of information and disorder. For example, a black hole exerting demonstrable influence on local systems while remaining unseen but not unperceived offers an analogy to such operations in Blake's dense and enriched textual fields. The term was coined to describe interactive fields of force manifesting periodic chaos and order in alteration. Okay, yeah, thanks, Anis. On we go. Now, here are two images from Tony Z's book, and it's what caught my attention. You'll notice that on the left, yet another image of Ancient of Days, but in this case, Elohim, or God, is actually leaning out of that other eye and casting dice. In the spirit of and in the support of Einstein's famous quote that God does not play dice with the universe. Of course, Stephen Hawking comes along and actually argues. I think it was actually at the tail end of Brief History of Time, and he says, well, the problem is that not only does God play dice, but occasionally throws them where they cannot be seen. And of course, there's a gesture to to quantum realities. And then Anthony Z's other image, of course, is a take on the Elohim creating Adam, except for here it's Elohim creating conditions that give rise to the cosmos. And Z says at the sort of tail end, he asked the question because Blake, very similar to, really very similar to Jacob Bronowski's use of Blake. As he says, well, I'm using the tiger, and I think there's at least 5 or 6 different physics books that are entitled Fearful Symmetry or work or trope off of Fearful Symmetry as part of the title. But Z says that, you know, Blake's poem on the burning tiger, interestingly enough, concludes in the last 2 stanzas by defining God, not by defining the tiger by God, which takes place at the beginning, across the beginning of the poem, but actually defines God by the nature of the tiger. And so there's a sort of a type of inversion there, and as it turns out, Anthony Z's book, Fearful Symmetry, is packed with these types of appropriations and transmutations of Blake as a way of unveiling something for readers in the sciences. And before we go to the next slide, I'll just simply say that one of the ways I got interested in this type of project, I mean, I grew up in a small town in Texas, and when I was 7, I was living in the midst of a swamp, and at 8, they built NASA, right? And so what happened is somebody moved into, I lived in a very small town on Galveston Bay, and people began to move in who were not local, but came to work in NASA. And so people began to feed, our next door neighbor in particular, who was a flight dynamics officer for the Gemini, I believe, the Gemini missions. He started passing me books all the time. And I realized slowly but surely that there was a great deal of overlap here. And then when Walter Sullivan published a relatively famous book called Black Holes, and it was given to me as a gift by my grandfather-in-law. I plowed through that thing, and then my grandfather-in-law said, "Well, why don't we just go take a walk to some place that I know you've never been," which was the observatory outside of San Diego, and as I walked towards the 200-inch giant telescope, you walk down a hallway with doors on each side. And as I walked down that hallway, one of the things that just struck me and surprised me was how many Blake quotes were on the doors of these observational physicists, and cosmologists. And so I think that it's not just that Blake people see the applicability of Blakean concepts, but in fact, the scientific community coming out of the age, coming out of the age of Jacob Bronowski, indicated that there was a great deal of accord. And so I began to, and so I was already reading lots of physics books, and I started keeping count. This is a little bit of a project that Mike Good and I share. I mean, we presented together, almost together, at the Global Blake Conference. Um, but there was this sense that Blake broke out of the bounds, and his work finds great accord and functions as an interesting mode of interpretation, while equally functioning as a strange attractor, that is, attracting physicists as well as lovers of poetry and lovers of books. Yeah, go ahead, Anis. Thank you. And so this is where I ended with the Global Blake Conference, and that is, it turns out that this is the most quoted passage in contemporary physics. What Mike Good was talking about at that conference was this is also in his research the most quoted Blake language around the world. And I would argue, or actually I am arguing in the larger piece, that the key to sweet science resides in this quatrain. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. I won't bore you, but in two different places, I sort of went through and presented, a fairly broad range of who actually is quoting this quatrain. And I think certainly in both romantic dynamics and in the Palgrave William Blake studies, where I do the science section, I think I actually presented about 50 books across a 20-year span that is using this quatrain to help people understand quantum dynamics, relativistic physics, and a host of other subcategories of what we would call theoretical physics. Okay, I think, Anis, I don't think there's any more slides, are there? Nope, I guess not. And so what I wanted to try and offer you today was a type of trajectory of this material, not just through Blake studies, but actually in certain weird ways, it's quite personal to me, because in the unfolding of these, I mean, I still actually every time I see this quatrain, I either make a Xerox copy of it or I record it and keep it in a folder. And I can't shut this folder anymore. There's so many evocations, and in such a huge band of evocations that it will be the next thing I do in my study of Blake and science. The only other thing I would say is if there's a missing science in Blake, I think it's that. We all know that Marx in the 19th century wanted to see Marxism as a scientist. As a science. Freud wanted to see psychoanalysis as a science. And the physical science and the psychological science that are both at play in this quatrain, that is the degree to which we can imagine them as the answer to what actually functions as sweet science in Blake, which comes at the end of night the 9th. Well, thank y'all. Y'all been very, you've been very patient with me, and I thank you for that. And uh, and now let's have a conversation. Yes, there you go.